1884 was a fateful year for the now diseased, ravaged, and underdeveloped continent of Africa, the start of the Berlin Conference. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 was a crucial turning point in African history, causing devastating long-term consequences in Africa through colonization. Although colonization provided infrastructure in African countries, it had little to no long-term positive effects, as uncolonized African countries are at a similar level of development as the colonized ones. The Berlin Conference was held starting in November 1884 and ending in February 1885, being held by European countries and moderated by the United States to supposedly regulate European colonization and trade in Africa. But more was afoot than what the conference promised to solve. Many countries involved in the conference had ulterior motives other than simply a foothold in a developing continent. Not known to the millions living in Africa at the time, Europe was coming. A main factor behind why the Berlin Conference was convened was for European countries to work out policies and agreements around the occupation, trade, and defining which regions European countries would hold in Africa. Almost all European powers at the time attended the conference, with the major players being the colonial empires of Belgium, France, Great Britain, Italy, and Germany. A power not mentioned was the International Congo Society, a supposedly philanthropic association founded and funded by King Leopold II, the current ruler of Belgium at the time. The International Congo Society is thought to be the first colonizers of Africa, as King Leopold II used it before the conference as a vessel to colonize the Congo and use philanthropy as a front for his exploitation of the rubber industry. An important point to note is that there was no African representation at the conference, and the African borders implemented were technically arbitrary, albeit globally recognized. The conference officially adjourned on February 26, 1885, which set into motion multiple discussed points in the conference. A particularly crucial part of the act that was passed was the promise to end slavery all across the African and Islamic parts that the European powers colonized. This was an attempt to sway the public and local approval of Europe's rule in Africa, as the slave trade was a controversial issue at the time. A quote from the conference spoken by Otto von Bismarck, the then Chancellor of the German Empire, reads, "The labors which we are about to undertake to regulate and develop the commercial relations of our countrymen with that continent, and to render a service alike to the cause and peace of humanity." This quote demonstrates the attempt to sway the population and to present the conference as a humanitarian effort in Africa. The Berlin Conference was a turning point that expressly caused colonization, as it was the spark that led Europe to divvy up Africa for its own sake. These European countries all had one goal in common: to gain a profit off of the untapped potential these African countries held. However, to do this, they first had to develop these countries in some form, constructing infrastructure to be able to move people and resources around and out of Africa efficiently. This infrastructure included railways, shipports, businesses, and residential areas. At the time, this turned things around in a major way for the African countries, as their economies were thriving and they had enough infrastructure to support basic development at the time. The industry in Africa at the time mostly consisted of the extraction and processing of primary resources to export to more developed countries. The other countries would take the cheap resources from Africa and use them to produce and sell products. Resources from Africa helped fuel Industrial Revolution, which in of itself was a turning point in many countries. These resources exported from African countries led to invention and innovation for years to come. However, all this innovation and income stemming from these African countries didn't come without major downfalls. Resources were taken by these European powers with little payment to the natives living and harvesting for Europe's benefit. However, as long as these countries were colonized and were turning a decent enough profit, money would continue to be pumped into the development of advanced technologies and infrastructures. As beneficial colonization could seem to all countries involved on the surface, it always led to deceit, exploitation, and ultimately the death of millions. Colonization has had no positive effects on colonized African countries and could have even left them worse than before. We do know that it led to the death of millions upon millions of innocent native Africans, all for Europe's pursuit for a more prosperous continent. Dangerous, unsafe working conditions with policies in place to extract resources as quickly as possible was one of the many reasons that Europe made Africa the fatal country that it is now. However bad it left Africa, Europe and some other parts of the world at the time benefited positively from colonization. A potentially positive effect of colonization was the bolstered World War I European war efforts through income from African exports and compulsory recruited African soldiers. Colonization also contributed to globalization efforts, which was especially helpful for Africa at the time, as it was essentially isolated from the rest of the world. Money and resources continued to be pumped into African countries until around 10 years after World War II, 1956. This year sparked a chain effect and initiated mass decolonization throughout all of Africa. Through the years 1956 to 1966, over 30 African countries were decolonized and left to fend for themselves. Not having a European overlord meant that they also didn't have European support on their side. The support of European countries were crucial for these developing nations, as all development ceased once they didn't have the resources to back it. This also crippled natural resources in Africa, as Europe had left them with much less than before. This GDP per capita graph of sub-Saharan African countries demonstrates a continuous growth of the economy, but when compared to a graph of the same data using the United States, we see that the United States has around 45 times greater GDP per capita. Even though the GDP of the African countries is rising, we should expect a huge leap as the countries develop, but from 1960 to the present day, it only rose around 1,500 points in total. Using this data, it shows that where we should have expected a leap, the economy flatlined and is severely underdeveloped compared to other industrial economies. Not having support also created a major primary export dependency in African countries and a dependence on developed countries to import finished products into Africa. African countries don't have the technology or infrastructure to be able to process the primary goods they harvested into finished products. This means that they would have to sell these primary goods at a lower price than they would be as a product, and ultimately make a small profit margin, one that wouldn't be enough for a developing country. We can contrast with a country that had a similar path to these aforementioned African countries, India. India, or the British Raj as it was known at the time, was placed under direct British rule in 1958, only 30 years before the Berlin Conference. It was also decolonized in a way after World War II, as the British released it from its control, rendering it independent. It would seem that this would mean India would be in a similar situation as Africa, having no more support from Britain. However, India was different in a few ways. The Indian and British economies were very closely intertwined, which kept supporting India in return for aid, whether providing manpower or exports to Britain. This catapulted India into the future, having continued backing from a foreign benefactor. However, India has had support in the past from the Mughal Empire compared to the practically untouched Africa. India also had monumental population numbers, which may have either aided or harmed them. One factor we can study to see the effects of support from developed countries is the Human Development Index, which is a factor that demonstrates the level of development of countries through multiple factors. We can see this effect by specifically comparing the HDI index of India versus the struggling African countries in the present day. India, with available and enough current infrastructure to support its economy, ranks 132nd out of 191 countries in the index. This may seem like India is as underdeveloped as the African countries, but only a few countries under special circumstances, such as South Africa and Egypt, rank above India. This demonstrates that the continued support of these developed European countries bolstered development and brought a high quality of life to the countries. African countries seem to have slowed development monumentally since decolonization, as demonstrated by this chart. Not much significant growth was made from 1960 to the current day, which demonstrates how important the Berlin Conference was and how it set up Africa for failure. The Berlin Conference constructed artificial borders in Africa that later caused major conflicts, which wasted time and resources that could have been better devoted to developing the continent as a whole. Most of these conflicts started due to a pretty simple reason overlooked by European countries when dividing Africa: the pre-existing borders implemented by African natives. Another long-term effect of colonization was the religion brought into African countries, primarily Christianity from European countries. Religion eventually became a hot topic as it has affected many aspects of African culture and policy, one example being the Ethiopian Christian-Muslim conflicts. The Berlin Conference was a major turning point in history as it has had devastating, irreversible effects on Africa as a whole. The current issues and turmoil in Africa can be directly connected to the Berlin Conference and our objective effects of it. Africa as it is has little chance of making itself into a major power unless nurtured by a now developed country to provide the framework for further development in the future. Some countries have been provided this development and have a promising future, such as South Africa and Egypt, but as for the rest of Africa, the future looks quite grim.